I never thought a cigarette would lead to anything, but there I was, standing on my apartment building's fire escape, halfway through a smoke break, when this guy leaned over the railing and asked me for one. Not the usual thing that happens in my neighborhood. Usually, people keep to themselves, or just give a nod. But this guy, he looked nervous, almost like he wasn't sure if he should be there at all. I was halfway through my pack already, and figured, why not? I pulled one out and held it out. "You want one?" I said, trying to sound casual, like I wasn't paying much attention to the stranger hovering a few feet away on the neighboring fire escape. He hesitated, then nodded, lips twitching into this brief, awkward smile that made me realize he probably wasn't a smoker. "Thanks," he said, lighting up like it was some kind of forbidden fruit. That's when I actually looked at him properly for the first time. He was about my age, early 30s, with this messy dark hair that kind of curled at the ends and these green eyes that had this restless, searching look like he was trying to figure out exactly where he was, or maybe where he wanted to be. "Name's Lucas," he said, blowing out a quick puff of smoke that vanished into the chilly evening air. I introduced myself, and we fell into that easy, borderline awkward chatter that happens when two strangers stand close enough to see the cracks in each other's faces, but don't really know what to say. The city buzzed around us. Distant horns, the occasional shout from below, the hum of life doing its thing. But up there, on those two fire escapes, just a few feet apart, it felt like we were in an entirely different world. Then, after a pause, Lucas looked at me kind of sideways, like he was debating whether to ask something he probably shouldn't. And then he did. "Can I ask you for something else?" he said, voice low. I blinked. That was not what I expected. I mean, I thought the cigarette was the something else. But no. This was different. More urgent. Maybe even a little desperate. "Sure," I said, because honestly, why not? The night was young, the city was loud, and this guy, Lucas, felt like he was about to tip the whole evening into something neither of us could have predicted. And that's when he told me exactly what he wanted. He looked at me like I was the only person who could understand the weird mix of hope and fear in his eyes. "Can I borrow your phone?" "Just for a minute," he said. "I need to make a call. It's important." I raised an eyebrow. "Your phone's dead?" I asked, glancing at the way he held his hand in his pocket like he was hiding something. He shook his head. "No," he said. "I left it inside. Forgot it." Then he shrugged, like it was no big deal. But the way he said it made me feel like it was definitely a big deal. I hesitated for a second. Part of me wanted to just say no and go back inside, but something about Lucas made me want to stick around. So I pulled out my phone and handed it over. "Here," I said. He took it, fingers brushing mine for a split second, and then he was tapping the screen, scrolling through contacts. "I just need to call my roommate," he explained. "He's expecting me." I got caught up and, yeah. I nodded, trying to make sense of it all, but also kind of enjoying this weird little connection that had sprung up between us. The city lights flickered behind him, casting half his face in shadow and half in light, like he was caught somewhere between two worlds. "Who should I call?" I asked. He hesitated again, like the question was harder than it seemed. Then he scrolled and selected a contact labeled Jamie. "This one," he said. "Okay," I said. He pressed the green button and held the phone to his ear. His expression changed immediately. He went from nervous to tense, like the words on the other end were hitting him hard. I almost didn't want to listen in, but this was the kind of moment that makes you lean in anyway. "Hey, Jamie, it's me. Yeah, I'm on the fire escape." He glanced over at me quickly, like asking for permission, or maybe just acknowledging that I was there. I know. I'm sorry I didn't tell you I'd be late. Things just got complicated." I could see his jaw tighten. "No, I'm fine. I just needed a minute." "Yeah. Could you come up? I think I'm locked out." He gave me a quick, apologetic look. "Thanks." He hung up and handed the phone back to me, but his fingers lingered. "Thanks," he said quietly. "Don't mention it." I said, still trying to figure out who this guy was and how I'd somehow gotten pulled into his late-night drama. A beat passed, and then he said, Mind if I join you for a smoke? I'm trying to calm down. I shrugged. Sure. I mean, that's why I'm out here anyway. We stood there together, the silence between us kind of comfortable. I learned that Lucas was new to the city, just moved a few weeks ago for a job that wasn't quite what he expected. The smoke curled up around us, mingling with the chilly night air. After a while, he looked over at me and laughed softly. You know, I wasn't even going to ask for a cigarette. I just wanted to know if anyone around here was friendly. I smiled. Well, consider me your friendly neighborhood fire escape buddy. He looked at me like he might say something more, but then the stairwell door opened behind him with a loud clang. Jamie, his roommate, appeared, looking equally annoyed and relieved. There you are, Jamie said. I was about to call a locksmith. Lucas gave me a quick, grateful nod. Thanks for the phone, he said. No problem, I replied. Jamie shot me a quick look and then said, I'll take him inside before he causes any more trouble out here. Lucas turned back to me, hesitation in his eyes. Maybe I'll see you around, he asked. Yeah, I said, feeling weirdly hopeful. I'd like that. He smiled, really smiled this time, like the kind of smile that's less about politeness and more about something honest. Then he followed Jamie inside, and the door shut behind them. I stood there for a long time after, staring at the cigarette between my fingers, wondering how a random smoke break had turned into the start of something I didn't see coming. The city was still loud, but now it felt different, like it was holding its breath, waiting for whatever happened next, and honestly, so was I. The next few days, I kept catching myself glancing out my window, half expecting to see Lucas's face leaning over the railing again. But the fire escape stayed empty. Part of me wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing, or if he was just some kind of mirage, a brief spark in the routine hum of my life. Then, about 3 nights later, there he was, back on his fire escape, this time without the nervous edge, just standing there like he belonged. I grabbed my jacket and headed out, cigarette pack in hand, because, honestly, I didn't want to miss whatever this was turning into. When I got close, he looked up, saw me, and smiled. That same honest, warm smile that struck me the first time. Hey, he called softly. Hey, I said, lighting a cigarette as I stepped onto my fire escape. We stood there, close enough to hear each other without shouting, watching the city lights blink on and off, the sounds of cars and distant music filling the night air. It was comfortable, the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty. So, Lucas started, flicking ash off his cigarette. You smoke a lot? I laughed. Enough to make these smoke breaks a thing. Helps me think. He nodded like he understood. Yeah, I get that. We talked for a while after that, about the city, work, the weirdness of starting over somewhere new. Lucas told me he was a graphic designer, but he wasn't loving the job like he thought he would. I told him I worked nights at a bookstore down the street, which was honestly the best gig I'd ever had, even if it didn't pay much. At some point he asked, do you ever feel like you're stuck somewhere? Not just physically, but in life? I thought about it. The answer was yes, more than I wanted to admit. All the time. Lucas lit another cigarette, staring out at the city. Me too. I moved here thinking I'd start fresh, but I'm realizing it's not about where you are, it's about who's around. That hit me hard. Because maybe it wasn't just the city that felt heavy, it was the loneliness. The nights when you wonder if anyone really sees you. Maybe, I said quietly, you just found someone nearby tonight. Lucas looked at me then, and the air between us shifted. I could feel it. The electricity that had nothing to do with the smoke or the cold. It was something simpler but fiercer, something that makes you sit a little straighter and wonder where it could go. Before I could say more, there was a sudden noise from below, a shout, the sound of someone running. We both jumped, startled, and Lucas cursed under his breath. Sorry, he said. That's Jamie. He's got a temper sometimes. I nodded, but I could tell this wasn't just about the noise. There was something else in Lucas's eyes now, a kind of tension that hadn't been there before. Like he was holding something back. I should probably get inside, he said reluctantly. Yeah, I agreed, not wanting the night to end but knowing it had to. He looked at me again, and for a moment, I thought he might say something more, but then he just smiled and said, "Thanks for the smoke, and the company." I smiled back, already counting down the moments until next time. As he disappeared inside, I felt this strange mix of hope and something else, like the start of a story I wasn't ready to finish just yet. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Lucas, about the way a cigarette had turned into a conversation, which had turned into something more. It was terrifying and exciting all at once. The next morning, when I got to work, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from an unknown number. "Hey, it's Lucas. I don't have your number yet, but I was wondering if you want to grab coffee sometime?" I stared at the screen, heart pounding like it was about to jump out of my chest. I typed back, "Absolutely." And just like that, something that had started with a cigarette on a fire escape was suddenly the most important thing in my life. Meeting Lucas for coffee felt like stepping into a scene I'd been imagining all week but never thought would actually happen. We chose this little place a few blocks from my bookstore. Nothing fancy, just enough warmth inside to shake off the chill of the morning. When I walked in, he was already there, sitting by the window with that same messy hair and those green eyes that seemed to catch every little flicker of light. He waved me over with a shy smile, the kind that makes you forget how nervous you were just seconds ago. We ordered our drinks, black coffee for me, some complicated-sounding latte for him, and settled into a booth. I was surprised by how easy it felt to talk to him, like the cigarettes and fire escapes had broken down some invisible wall between us. We swapped stories about bad jobs, the city's quirks, and the weird little things that make life bearable. "I still can't believe you left your phone on the fire escape," I teased. He laughed, a little embarrassed. "Yeah, classic me. Always forgetting something." There was this moment when he looked down at his cup like he was gathering the courage to say something. Then he looked up, eyes locking with mine, and said, "I'm glad I did, though. Otherwise, I might never have met you." I felt my chest tighten in a good way. "Me too," I said honestly. As we talked, I noticed the way his smile softened when he laughed, the little crease that appeared at the corner of his eyes. There was something about him, something real and vulnerable, that pulled me in. I realized I hadn't felt that in a long time. After a while, the conversation turned quieter, more thoughtful. Lucas looked out the window and said, "I've been trying to figure out who I am in this city, who I want to be. It's harder than I thought." I nodded. "It always is. But sometimes, it's the people who show up unexpectedly that help you figure it out." He smiled again, and this time it felt like a promise. "Maybe that's you then." We spent the whole morning like that. No rush, no pressure, just two people sharing time and space. When it was time to leave, we stood outside the cafe, the sun warming our faces. "So," I said, trying to keep the nerves from creeping back in, "coffee again sometime?" Lucas grinned. "Definitely." That became our thing. Coffee dates, late-night walks, random hangouts where we'd end up talking about everything and nothing. We learned each other's favorite music, the books that shaped us, the little fears that felt too silly to admit. I found myself looking forward to those moments more than I expected, the way you do when someone starts to feel like home. One night, a couple of weeks in, we ended up back on the fire escape, our unofficial meeting spot. The city was quieter then, the streetlights casting long shadows. Lucas leaned against the railing, hands in his pockets, and looked over at me. "You know," he said quietly, "I never thought a cigarette would change anything." I smiled. "Neither did I." He took a deep breath. "But it did. You did." The words hung between us, heavy and bright all at once. I stepped closer, heart pounding. "Lucas," I said, "I'm really glad you asked for that cigarette." He smiled, the kind of smile that reaches the eyes and makes you think, maybe, just maybe, everything's gonna be okay. And in that moment, surrounded by the city lights and the quiet hum of the night, I realized that sometimes the smallest things, the chance encounters, the borrowed cigarettes, can lead to the biggest changes. That night on the fire escape felt like a turning point. But like most things worth feeling, it wasn't some grand gesture or dramatic confession. It was quiet, almost shy, and wrapped up in the kind of easy warmth that settles between two people who've been carefully inching towards something real. We stood there for a while longer, just looking out at the city. Lucas flicked the end of his cigarette, watching the embers glow in the darkness. I could tell he was thinking, maybe weighing whatever was inside him that he wasn't ready to say yet. Finally, he broke the silence. "Can I ask you something a little weird?" "Try me," I said, leaning against the railing. He smiled, that little nervous curl at the corner of his mouth. "Would you want to come back to my place? I mean, if you want. No pressure or anything. It feels like we should spend more time together, you know?" My heart did this ridiculous flip, and I had to remind myself to breathe. "Yeah, I'd like that." We climbed down the fire escape, careful not to make too much noise. The hallway inside was dimly lit, and as we walked, I realized how easy it felt to be with him, like I could forget about the usual walls I kept up. At his apartment, the place was small but cozy, filled with the kind of clutter that made it feel lived in. Sketches and prints were taped to the walls, and a guitar rested in the corner. Lucas poured us both a glass of wine, and we sat on the couch, close enough that our knees touched. We talked for hours about dreams, regrets, favorite songs. I learned he'd moved here to escape a relationship that had drained him dry, one where he'd felt invisible. And I shared my own stories of trying to find where I belonged, the long stretches of loneliness that sometimes swallowed me whole. At one point, his hand brushed mine, tentative and searching. I didn't pull away. Instead, I closed the gap, fingers intertwining with his. "It's weird," he said softly, eyes on our joined hands. I wasn't expecting this when I asked for that cigarette. Neither was I admitted. The night stretched on and eventually the wine bottle was empty. The city outside had quieted, but inside that small apartment, something had woken up, something I hadn't realized I'd been waiting for. When it was time to leave, we stood at the door, the weight of the evening hanging between us. "Do you want to do this again?" Lucas asked, voice low. I smiled, feeling more certain than I had in a long time. "Yeah, definitely." Over the next few weeks, our lives started to weave together in the easiest, most natural way. We'd share dinners, take late-night walks, and sometimes just sit in comfortable silence, knowing the other was there. One evening, we found ourselves back on those fire escapes, the place where it all began. Lucas lit a cigarette and offered me one, just like before, but this time there was a spark in his eyes, a quiet promise. "I don't think I'm stuck anymore," he said, exhaling slowly. "Not with you around." I looked at him, feeling that same hope bloom inside me. Me neither. It wasn't some perfect fairy tale moment. It was messy and real, full of uncertainty and fear. But it was ours. And sometimes, that was enough. Things between Lucas and me settled into a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural, considering how unexpectedly everything had started. Our fire escape conversations became less about cigarettes and more about the small details, the kind of stuff you only share with someone when you're starting to care. One Friday night, we found ourselves sprawled out on my couch, a record spinning some old indie band that neither of us really liked but couldn't be bothered to change. The place smelled like coffee and the faint trace of whatever takeout we'd ordered. Lucas was flipping through a dog-eared sketchbook he'd brought over, showing me drawings of cityscapes and people he'd seen around town. "Your lines are really good," I said, leaning over to get a better look at a sketch of a homeless man sitting on a bench, cigarette dangling from his fingers. "Thanks," Lucas said, his smile quiet and a little shy. "I guess I try to capture moments, the messy in-between stuff." I nodded, feeling an unexpected pang. "Kind of like us." He looked up at me, eyes soft but searching. "Yeah, like us." For the first time, the vulnerability between us wasn't just in the background, it was front and center. I could feel it in the way our shoulders brushed, in the way his hand lingered just a little longer on my arm. Then, just as the silence started to stretch and get a little heavy, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and then hesitated, like he wasn't sure if he wanted to answer. I caught the flicker of something, anxiety maybe, and said, "Everything okay?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's Jamie," he said quietly. "He's been stressed at work lately. I think he's taking it out on me." I didn't say anything at first, just watched him. There was something raw in how he said that, like he was carrying more than just his own weight. Lucas met my gaze. I don't know if I'm ready to deal with all that again. Hey, I said, reaching out to squeeze his hand. You don't have to. Not with me. He gave me a small, grateful smile, but the tension didn't completely leave his face. That night, as he left my apartment, I realized there were parts of him still tangled up in things he hadn't fully unpacked. Over the next few days, I noticed he was quieter, more distracted. Then, one evening, I got a text from him. Can we talk? It's important. When he showed up at my door later that night, the weight in his eyes was impossible to miss. We sat down, and Lucas took a deep breath. Jamie and we've been fighting a lot. It's not just stress. I think he's struggling with who he is, and it's making everything harder between us. I nodded, letting him speak without interruption. I tried to be patient, he continued, voice cracking a little. But sometimes, I feel like I'm losing myself in all this. I don't want to be angry or distant, but sometimes I don't know how else to protect myself. I reached out, pulling him into a hug. You don't have to protect yourself from me. He rested his head on my shoulder, and for a moment, the chaos of his life seemed to quiet down. That night, we talked long into the early morning, not just about Jamie, but about what Lucas wanted, what he deserved. Days later, Lucas made a decision that surprised me. He told Jamie they needed space, that he needed to focus on himself for a while. It was hard and messy, but also necessary. As he stepped back into my life with clearer eyes and a lighter heart, I felt something shift between us, like the walls that had been holding him back were finally starting to crumble. One evening, we met up at a small park near the river, the city skyline glowing behind us. Lucas took my hand and looked at me with a kind of quiet certainty I hadn't seen before. I'm ready to stop running, he said softly. To stop pretending that I have all the answers. I smiled, squeezing his hand. Neither do I, but we can figure it out together. We stood there for a while, just holding on, the city humming around us like it was rooting for us both. And in that moment, I realized that sometimes the hardest part isn't finding someone to love, but having the courage to let yourself be loved back. After that night by the river, things between Lucas and me started to get quieter in a good way. Not in the sense that the connection dimmed, but more like we were settling into a comfortable space where we didn't have to prove anything to each other. It was the kind of ease that comes when you can be yourself, flaws and all, and still feel held together. One Saturday afternoon, Lucas showed up at my door, grinning like he'd just pulled off some small victory. I have a surprise for you, he said, holding up a canvas tote bag that looked suspiciously heavy. I raised an eyebrow, curious but cautious. All right, what's in the magic bag? He gave me a playful nudge as we stepped into the hallway. Only the best excuse to ditch your bookstore shift for a couple of hours. I laughed, but I was intrigued. We hopped on the subway, and I tried to guess where he was taking me. When we finally emerged from the station, the smell of fresh paint and old wood hit me before I even saw the place. It was a tiny art studio tucked between a coffee shop and a record store, filled with natural light and the faint scent of turpentine. Lucas beamed. I thought maybe we could try painting together. No pressure, just us, some colors, and a chance to make a mess. I looked at him, surprised, but honestly excited. You sure? I'm not exactly Picasso. He shrugged with that signature grin. That's the point. It's about having fun, not making masterpieces. We spent the next couple of hours slapping paint on canvases, laughing at the ridiculous shapes we created, the way our brushes sometimes collided or missed the canvas entirely. Lucas was surprisingly good, but what stuck with me most was the way he got lost in the process. His brow furrowed, lips pressed together in concentration, then breaking into a smile when a color mixed just right. At one point, I caught him looking at me out of the corner of his eye. You're pretty good at this, he said, teasing. Yeah, well, don't get your hopes up. I'm a natural disaster with a brush, I joked back. That night, as we walked home under a sky smeared with stars, I realized this was the first time in a long time I felt genuinely at peace. It wasn't about rushing or fixing what was broken. It was about creating something new, together. Over the next few weeks, those little adventures became our thing. Sometimes it was painting. Other times, it was exploring hidden parts of the city, finding hole-in-the-wall diners or quirky bookstores. Each moment felt layered with something tender and unexpected. One evening, after a long day, Lucas invited me over to cook dinner with him. His apartment smelled like garlic and fresh herbs, and the tiny kitchen was a mess of chopping boards and half-open spice jars. As we cooked, Lucas told me about how he used to hate cooking because it reminded him of his ex, how every meal was a reminder of what he lost. But now, he said, cooking felt like reclaiming a part of himself. We laughed when I accidentally spilled red wine on his rug, and he teased me mercilessly. When the food was finally ready, we ate by candlelight, talking about everything from childhood memories to dreams we didn't dare say out loud before. After dinner, we ended up back on the fire escape, the place where it all began. Lucas leaned into me, his forehead resting against mine. "I never thought I'd find this," he murmured. "Me neither," I replied, feeling my heart swell. That night we didn't say much, but the silence spoke volumes. It was the kind of quiet that only comes when two people are completely comfortable with each other, when words aren't necessary to feel connected. But life, as always, had a way of mixing joy with challenges. A few days later, Lucas got a call from Jamie. Apparently, Jamie wanted to meet, to talk, to try and work things out. Lucas seemed torn when he told me. "I don't know if I'm ready, or if I even want to go back to that," he said, eyes flickering with uncertainty. I didn't push him. Instead, I just held his hand and said, "Whatever you decide, I'm here." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw a flicker of something fragile and hopeful. A week later, Lucas told me he had met with Jamie. It was messy and painful, but it gave him clarity. He realized that chapter was closing, and he wanted to focus on what was in front of him. With that door closed, Lucas seemed lighter, as if he'd shed a weight he didn't realize he'd been carrying. We celebrated with a spontaneous trip to the beach, a day filled with sun, salty air, and the kind of laughter that makes your ribs ache. We walked barefoot, kicked rocks into the surf, and talked about the future like it was a secret we were only just starting to share. That night, as we lay on a blanket under the stars, Lucas turned to me and said, "I'm scared sometimes, but with you, it feels okay." I squeezed his hand. "Me too, but maybe that's the point." In the quiet of that night, with the ocean's rhythm in the background and the city far behind us, I knew I wanted to keep building this, whatever it was, with him. Because sometimes, all it takes is one cigarette, one moment of kindness, to change everything. The weeks after that beach day felt like we were moving in sync for the first time. A slow, steady rhythm that didn't need constant talking or grand gestures to feel real. Lucas and I had carved out a space together that was messy and imperfect, but ours. There were still tough days, moments when the shadows of his past crept in, or my own insecurities bubbled up. But instead of running from those moments, we faced them side by side. One evening, sometime after dinner, we found ourselves back on the fire escape, the place where this all started with a cigarette, a borrowed phone, and a simple ask. Lucas pulled me close, not rushing, just steady and sure. "Do you remember that first night?" he asked, voice low, a smile tugging at his lips. I nodded. "I was half expecting you to be a random stranger who disappeared as quickly as you showed up." He laughed softly. "Me too, but here we are." We stayed there, wrapped up in the quiet hum of the city, the glow of streetlights painting soft patterns on the walls. There was a kind of magic in the ordinary moments. No fireworks, just two people who'd found something worth holding on to. "I don't know what the future holds," Lucas said after a while, "but I know I want to figure it out with you." My heart felt like it was going to burst. Same here. That night, we made a promise. Not the kind that demands perfection, but the kind that says we'll show up for each other even when it's hard. Looking back, it's crazy to think how something as small as a cigarette led me to this. To a person who saw me, who let me see him, in all the messy, beautiful ways that matter. Sometimes life gifts you a moment so unexpected, it changes everything. For me, that moment was leaning over a fire escape railing and handing a cigarette to a stranger named Lucas. And now? Now it's not about cigarettes or fire escapes anymore. It's about us. Two imperfect people learning how to be together, one day at a time. And honestly, I wouldn't have it any other way.